Well, good evening. My name is John Brofonsky. I'm the Chief of Police here in Bedford, New Hampshire, and this is the Bedford Building Our Lives Drug-Free, BeBOLD's first speaker series for the fall 2017. The fourth Monday of every month, BeBOLD hosts an important speaker series event here at the Bedford Public Library between 7 and 8 p.m. To bring attention and awareness and education to the community regarding substance abuse and the problems that go along with it. So this is our first BeBOLD speaker series for the month. We'll be continuing those again every fourth Monday between 7 and 8 p.m. at the Bedford Public Library here in Bedford, New Hampshire. Tonight, we're very happy to have with us Marty Boldin, who is the Governor of New Hampshire's Policy Advisor on Substance Abuse Treatment and Recovery. Mr. Boldin is going to talk to us tonight about the stereotyping and impact of stereotyping of drug abuse and how that affects the community, how that affects treatment, recovery, and addiction.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. Okay. So I want to start off by saying my name is Marty Boldin, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. And for me, that means that I've been sober since October 5th of 1987. On top of that, I'm also the Governor's Policy Advisor for Prevention, Treatment, and Recovery. I have a master's degree in social work. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker, a master's level alcohol and drug counselor. I'm licensed to clinically supervise people in behavioral health. And I'm also a PhD candidate at the Boston University School of Social Work. And I guess the reason I start off with that is that my very presence up here and discussing this matter kind of defies some of the stereotypes about what addiction is and what recovery looks like. And so sort of give that a second to marinate, because this issue is extraordinarily important to us. And our public discourse on addiction is fairly unnuanced. And so for over 30 years now, I've been traveling all over the country talking to a lot of people about addiction and what it means and what it's like to be involved in addiction recovery and what is treatment and all those kinds of things. And the first question I end up asking people is, what do you think addiction is? And the reason I ask that is because depending on who you ask that question to and the environment you ask it in, you get a fairly broad range of answers, but almost all of them involve a stereotype. And so when I start off like asking people to take a look at addiction, one of the things that they'll tell me is they'll say that it's about alcoholism, or that it's about being addicted to crack, or that it's about heroin use. And every time you discuss this, images that we mostly get from the media come to play. And what I can tell you is I've literally, as a counselor, treated tens of thousands of people. And while some of them might bear a distant relationship to the stereotypes, that for the most part, the stereotypes are really not useful. The stereotypes not only hurt us in society in the way that we look at addiction, it hurts the way that people who have addiction look at themselves. And so when I left my job as the director of the Office of Youth Services in New Hampshire and Manchester and went to pursue my PhD, I was really interested in addiction stigma and what that looks like and what that can yield to help us find better and more effective ways to treat addiction. And so I found out a couple of very interesting things about addiction stigma, or about stigma in general. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that in the literature, in all the scientific studies, and qualitative studies, and quantitative studies that have anything to do with addiction, there's one significant problem that befuddles almost all researchers, and that's that there's no agreed upon definition of what stigma is. And so, for those of you who don't know the origin of stigma, the word actually comes from Latin, and the origin of it actually was that people who were slaves in society would be tattooed, and that external tattoo would allow you to know that they were a slave, that they did not have basically the rights of a citizen. And so the many times people that were stigmatized were teachers. They actually in Roman society, people that were slaves held significant positions in politics and government. They served in the military. They were advisors to people. One of the fathers of Western civilization from Greek culture, Socrates, was a slave. And so the whole idea that we have about what it means to be a slave and what it meant to be a slave several thousand years ago is slightly different. But because you were stigmatized, you did not have the right to fully participate in Roman society. In other words, you couldn't vote, and you couldn't own land, you couldn't own property. And so while these people were essentially no different than anyone else, save the mark that they had, they enjoyed completely different rights to what it meant to be a citizen or to operate in Roman society. And so if you take that work forward several thousand years to the early 1950s, there was a famous sociologist named Erving Goffman who studied stigma. And he specifically studied stigma in populations of people that at the time were highly undesirable. Perhaps one of the most discriminated groups of people in the 1950s in the United States, homosexual men. And one of the things that he looked at was that he looked at the way that people experienced stigma and then how that affected their behavior. And basically, Goffman discerned that basically there were two kinds of stigma that people had. There was the stigma that people had that everybody else knew about. So if you were a person that were a person of color, and people discriminated against people of color, there was no way for you to hide that stigma. You would walk around and people would see it. And then the other kind of stigma that Goffman talked about was the stigma that people had that they knew they had, but it was hidden. They were carrying it around inside of them. So, like, for example, people who belonged to organizations that were highly discriminated against. And so what Goffman studied was the way that people responded to having stigma. And what he found was pretty interesting. He found that what people would start to do is they would basically develop two narratives. A public narrative that they talked about themselves, and then a private narrative. And one of the things that he found out about the public narrative was that when somebody knew that their stigma was something that could actually be actualized, it was a secret they had, that they would be around other people who actually held that stigma, and while they were around those people, they would pretend that they held the stigma too. And so the reason this is important to me as an alcohol and drug counselor is that when I work with people who have problems with addictions, one of the first things I have to figure out is whether or not the person I'm working with thinks that they have a problem. Because my whole life is about, okay, if somebody sent you to me, if you got in trouble at home, or you got in trouble at work, or you got in trouble in the criminal justice system, and somebody sent you to come talk to me, a lot of people feel like they don't really have a problem. The problem is they got caught. The problem is that somebody looked at them and identified them as having a problem. And even though they may regret a thing that they did, they don't really think that they have a problem with addiction. And so one of the things that happens when we talk to people about their experience with substance misuse, and they actually have a problem with alcohol or other drug misuse, is that we find that talking to them about the problem we think that they might have may not be the same experience that they have with that problem. And while it's certainly true that we don't have a standard definition about what addiction stigma is, we know exactly what it does. And it does three really important things. The first thing it does is that if a person has a problem with alcohol or other drug misuse, stigma prevents them from seeking help. They don't want to be identified as a person with an alcohol and drug problem. So when they think that they might have a problem, or when somebody confronts them about the problem, they start to deny the impact of that problem and seeking help. And this is huge. This is a hugely important thing, because if you have a problem like alcohol or other drug misuse that's impacting your day-to-day life, and you're afraid to even talk about it because you're afraid of social or political repercussions on you for doing that, that's going to prevent people from coming into getting help. The second thing that it does is almost scarier than the first one, and that is that people who experience addiction stigma while they're in some kind of treatment will actually leave treatment early. So they're getting help, but as they're getting help, they start to understand that people around them, family, friends, coworkers, employers, think that they have this addiction problem and somehow that makes them less than, and then they leave help early. And then the last thing that it does, and this is probably the thing that I wanted us to talk about in this forum tonight, is that addiction stigma prevents communities from providing the kind of social safety net for people who have addictive disorders that they might. In other words, if I know that somebody has a problem with addiction, I might be less likely to want to help them out. There's an extremely famous study where they compare people that have that they ask people about, would you want this kind of person to be your neighbor? You know? And so the first thing that they ask somebody is, would you want somebody with depression to be your neighbor? And about 40% of people say, no, I would not want to have a next door neighbor who's depressed. Then the next thing they ask them about is, would you want somebody who has a problem with anxiety to be your neighbor? And about 40% of people say, I would not want that person to be my neighbor. And then they ask somebody, would you want somebody who has severe mental illness, schizophrenia, to be your next door neighbor? And about 60% of people say, no, I wouldn't want that person to be my neighbor. And then they say, would you want somebody with alcoholism or alcohol dependence to be your neighbor? And about 75% of people say that. And then finally they ask somebody, would you want somebody to be your neighbor who had a problem with drug dependency? And about 90% of people say, no, I definitely wouldn't want that to happen. And the reason I put that out there to you is that what we know about people and the way that people use alcohol or misuse alcohol and other drugs is that there's no way that 90% of us are not living next door to somebody who doesn't have an alcohol or drug problem. So I just want to give you a little bit of data here for a second, something that might help you out. We don't do a really good job of analyzing or understanding how deep or serious the alcohol or drug problem is in this country. The most common data set that we use is something called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And basically, this is a test that you take at home on your computer. The government gives you $35 in the computer. You sit at your computer for about 90 minutes. You answer a couple hundred questions. And basically, this test is given to 70,000 people every year. It's been given to 70,000 people every year since 1970. And there are 3 serious problems with the way that this data is collected. The first one is that it's completely based on self-report, meaning that if I ask somebody if they have an alcohol or other drug problem, the chances of them talking about that problem in the fullest extent of its problem is pretty limited. The second problem is that it does not include anybody who's incarcerated. The third problem is that it doesn't include anybody who's homeless. And even with that data, pretty consistently since 1970, the data tells us that about 1 person in 10 has a substance use problem. 1 person in 10. Just keep that number in mind for a second. So, like I said before, I got sober in 1987. I was 24 years old. I'm 54 years old now. That's about 30 years of recovery. And I moved to New Hampshire from Ohio in 2001. And so for those of you who've never lived in the Midwest, let me tell you something. New Hampshire is a slightly different place. But I was kind of lucky because I grew up outside of New York City in New Jersey. My wife was actually born and raised in the town that we moved from in Ohio. She only left for the 4 years she went to college. She worked there, she had family there, extended family there. And when we came Ohio. It was a very, very different situation for her. One of the things that's very popular in New Hampshire, and I don't know if people do it here, but in Ohio, people chat. Does anybody know what chatting is? So let me tell you what chatting is. Chatting is the art of talking about nothing for a long period of time.
I'm a professional.
Right? And so in Ohio, chatting is like an Olympic sport. If you go out for pancakes in Columbus, Ohio, and you stop at like an IHOP or a Denny's or something like that, your waitress and you will talk for 15 or 20 minutes about nothing before you order like anything on the menu whatsoever. And so when my wife came here to New Hampshire, nobody ever talked to anybody at all, especially during the winter. She thought it was a little bit strange. And so we got here. My youngest daughter was starting kindergarten that year. I was working. I worked a lot of hours. And then one day, out of nowhere, when I moved to New Hampshire, we moved to Concord, and I bought the smallest home with the longest driveway in the history of Concord. Our home was about 1,300 square feet, and our driveway was about 100 feet long. And I didn't know about snow, and so the first winter that I got here, I shoveled that driveway from beginning to end. And at the very end of that driveway, coming into my house, was a little tiny door. And one day, my wife was like in the kitchen doing stuff, and there was a knock on the door. And it was in the middle of winter, and nobody talks. So my wife went over to the door. One of our favorite neighbors opened up the door, and my wife said, "Come on in," thinking it was chatting time. But the neighbor was very concerned, and she came inside, stuck her head inside the door, didn't even come into the house the whole way, and asked my wife, she said, "Are you okay?" And my wife said, "Yeah, I think I'm okay." And she's like, no, really, are you okay?" And my wife said, "Well, why wouldn't I be okay?" Well, my youngest daughter, Marty, was going to kindergarten, and I'm a person in recovery. I talk about being in recovery. I've been talking about being in recovery the whole time, my whole life. You come to my house, you'll see recovery literature. There are books about recovery. I'm getting a freaking PhD in addiction, right? This is my life. And so the neighbor says to my wife, "Well, your daughter is telling everybody in the kindergarten class that your husband's an alcoholic. Are you okay?" And my wife said, "Yeah, we're fine. He's been in recovery for 14 years, and we talk about this, and that's why my daughter that's the way she experiences him." For me, for my family, for my kids, for people who know me, I've come to this place of comfort with who I am, right? I believe fully you can't be somebody you're not for somebody you ain't, right? And so it doesn't make sense for me to pretend to be something for anybody else. And the other thing is, and I'll tell you this, when I started off as an addiction counselor, I think I had internalized some discrimination and stereotype myself, because for a long time I kept really working hard to be a good guy. I really just wanted to be a good guy, because I felt like there was some kind of invisible line between people like me and the good people. And I can tell you this, I've listened, like I said before, to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And one thing I can assure you is everybody's got stuff. Everybody's got stuff. And so the longer I practice, the more I stopped being concerned about what other people thought about me, because when I listened to the leaders in our society talk about their stuff, I was like, all right, well, maybe your stuff happened in a different neighborhood with a different set of words, but our stuff is remarkably similar. And so for me, being out loud about being in recovery is not a recent phenomenon. But for a lot of people in our society, it's something that they feel like they cannot talk about. And when I say this, what I mean is I know lots and lots of people who've been sober 10, 20, 30 years who can't talk to anybody about it, whose employers don't know, who don't even talk to their parents about it, who don't talk to their children about it. And I think that that's something that bears some attention. There are 24 million people, adults, 1 in 10, 24 million people in the United States suffer from substance use disorder. Now, What does that number mean in New Hampshire? That means that there are approximately 60,000 people over the age of 12 in New Hampshire that suffer from substance use disorder. But here's that trick, right? I told you about that number. It doesn't include people that are incarcerated. It doesn't include homeless people. It doesn't, and it's based totally on self-report. So me, I don't know, you may think I'm nuts, but some people think I'm an expert. I think the number's soft. Here's the thing. In New Hampshire right now, for every 10 people, there's only enough treatment for one. For every 10 people that need help, there's only enough help for one. And this gets weird because just because somebody has the problem doesn't mean they want to do something about it. Just because they want to do something about it doesn't mean that they can get help. But I guess the concern that I have about this is that there's so much distance between the number of people who have an issue and the amount of help available that stigma plays right into that. If you have a problem that you can't get help for, one strategy of dealing with it is to say you don't have a problem. And so to me, the issue of stigma and the way that we respond and we think about stigma is absolutely critical from a public health perspective. If I think that people who have a problem shouldn't have a problem, then why should I think about helping those people through that problem? Why should I develop medical systems, or why should I develop access to care that will help people who have that problem get help? And I guess what I'd also say about this is that this problem that we have with recognizing addiction and the impact of addiction has been mirrored with a lot of other diseases in the history of the United States. Epilepsy, cancer are just two examples of diseases that people have had that have been stigmatized, and while they were stigmatized, people's ability to access treatment for them and the scientific research that was needed to be done to advance cure or remedy for those kinds of conditions was limited. It was not until we as a society recognized that these were issues that were not about a moral failing in people or lack of willpower or whatever, but that these are actually parts of being, that some disease is a part of being a human being. People ask me all the time, why are opiates a huge problem in New Hampshire? Well, really, the answer is pretty simple. There are three reasons why opiates are a significant problem in New Hampshire. One is that for about a decade before we discovered heroin, prescription drug misuse was a constant in the state. We were always in the top 10 nationally for that. That was one. The second reason, I believe, is that we have very fragile treatment infrastructure for people who have substance use disorder in the state. And the third one was that at the same time people were misusing prescription drugs, the cost of street heroin was going down to the floor. So that in 2008 and 2009 and 2010, you could buy heroin that would cost $30 a bag 25 years ago was going for $3 to $5 a bag in Boston. And so those factors combined created access to an extraordinarily addictive and powerful drug to people. And the reason that we're seeing so much casualty from this, so much disease and death, is because we moved very quickly from heroin to fentanyl, which is an extremely deadly and powerful drug. And so those factors together created an atmosphere in New Hampshire that lent us right for the opioid crisis that we see today. And of course, the stigma associated with heroin addiction, the stigma associated with IV drug use also limits the way that people seek and try to find help around that issue. With 24 million people needing treatment, and there only being enough treatment for 1 in 10, the economic costs of substance misuse in the state of New Hampshire are enormous. As a matter of fact, a study came out, I want to say in 2012, called the Gottlob Report, that estimated that the cost of addiction in New Hampshire annually was about $1.84 billion. And then, of course, you know that number is no longer good because in 2010 when the report came out, we weren't really looking at opioid addiction. And so today, in 2017, the amount of money that is cost, the financial cost of alcohol and other drug misuse in the state of New Hampshire is $2.36 billion annually. And just to put that in perspective, the entire state budget isn't more than $5-6 billion. So we're approaching half of the money that it takes to run a whole state is cost. It costs us to endure alcohol and other drug misuse. And the primary areas of cost are lost productivity. There are people out there simply cannot find employees to work in the businesses that can pass drug tests. The second area, as the chief can tell you, is criminology. We have significant costs in our criminal justice system that are tied to alcohol and other drug misuse. And then, of course, the last area where these costs are extreme are healthcare costs. Everything from psychological services to medical services to, one of the terrible consequences that we have not even begun to contemplate yet in this state is that when people use IV drugs and shared needles, that the increase of bloodborne illness is going to be enormous. And so when we think about hepatitis C or HIV or other kinds of significant illnesses that people have when they use IV drugs and don't use clean needles, I mean, there's the immediate cost, but the long-term medical cost of this epidemic are going to be significant to our budget and to the budget of the state in general. So one of the reasons I wanted to put that out there is that I think that we should be outraged. We should be outraged that we're having a problem. Forget what your personal beliefs are about addiction and its causes. But we're in the midst of a problem that is consuming about $2.36 billion annually, and we still have not found a way to treat it, to apply the appropriate response to it. Prevention programs need improvement. We people in the public, I think, should be outraged by the fact that we're not doing what it is we can be doing. We have not leveraged against this terrible thing as much resource as we might. And what I would say to you is that when you look at these costs amplify and multiply over time. And so I would hope that in this data point, people find a reason to think and talk more out loud about effective ways of addressing alcohol and other drug misuse. One of the huge issues that impacts people who experience stigma is that they feel a sense of shame. They feel like there's something wrong with them. And so one of the things I try to share with people right now is that people ask me all the time, like, well, what is it that, what causes addiction? Is it like some kind of weakness? Is it a bad family? Is it whatever? The data really points us in two pretty significant directions. The first one is what we believe, there's strong evidence for what we call genetic markers. So what's a genetic marker? Well, basically the data tells us this. If you look at your mom's side of the family or your dad's side of the family, if any person back 1 or 2 generations and neither side of your family has a problem with alcohol or other drugs, your likelihood of having a problem with alcohol or other drugs is somewhere around 30%. If there are 2 people on both sides, if you got one on your mom's side and one on your dad's side, your chance of having a problem is somewhere around 70%. Now that problem could be an everyday chronic problem with alcohol or drugs, the kind of thing that sent me into treatment, or it can be people have periodic problems with alcohol or other drug misuse. But one of the things that we absolutely know is that people who have a family history of addiction have a greater likelihood of developing addiction. I know I shocked everybody with that information. I know nobody ever heard anything like that before. Just hang on to your seats because the next one's even crazier. The second thing that we know about what probably causes a problem with alcohol or other drugs is that there are some people who simply have a higher tolerance for alcohol or other drugs. So my wife and I, right? We go out to a restaurant. So last night we went out to a Chinese place. I won't say where because we're on television. I don't want to advertise. But my wife asked for like tofu, General Tso's tofu. She eats tofu. I don't get it. But right, hopefully my wife will never see this, right? She likes tofu. If she's happy, I'm happy. But we went out. She's like, it's got to be like the non-spicy sauce. And I'm like, all right. And then I ordered shrimp with garlic sauce, and I said, well, make it extra spicy. Because for me, no matter how hot it is, right, like, I'm good. I like it. I like when the sweat's pouring off your face. I love hot food. So dinner comes, and my wife notices these red flecks. And she's like, oh, my gosh. Like, it's all over now. We're going to have to call the chef out. Who knows what we're going to do? And it wasn't. I think it was just like some kind of flake of something. But she is so sensitive that even the sight of something that looks spicy will send her into a whole different universe. Baby, if you're watching this, I love you. Anyway, but that's a difference in tolerance. And so as a guy who did addiction treatment for years and years and years with young people, one of the first markers that we see directly related to alcohol and other drug misuse is people, when they start initiating alcohol and other drug misuse, a certain cohort of young people can just drink more than other people can. They just drink more without the same kind of effect. They have a higher tolerance for it. And the fact that they have tolerance helps them build tolerance faster. We don't know why this happens. It seems to be random. My guess is at some point we may find something out about that, but right now we don't know. But we can tell basically based upon your family history, and if you do use alcohol or other drugs, how much you use at the initiation of use, whether or not it's likely you're going to have an alcohol or other drug problem. What that data tells us is that somewhere between 15 and 25% of people will have some kind of problem with alcohol or drugs over the course of their lifetime. And the only way that you get a society to be closer to 15% and farther away from 25% has to do with access points. The more access you have to alcohol or drugs in a given population, the higher percentage of problem that population will have with alcohol or other drugs. The way I put this is this: if you have neighborhood A and neighborhood B and they're identical, and they both have between a 15 and 25% chance of having a problem, if neighborhood A has 3 liquor stores and neighborhood B has 10 liquor stores, neighborhood B is going to have a higher incidence of alcohol and drug problems, just because it's more available. So a lot of times people will talk to me about, should we legalize marijuana? And I say in a state like New Hampshire that has virtually no treatment for adolescents, legalizing marijuana will increase access to what group of people? And we will logically see like an increase of people that have alcohol and or other drug problems in that group just because they have more access. So I'm not a fan of the legalization of marijuana. I'm sure we'll get some emails about that. Another way that people are impacted with substance misuse problems is that they become involved in the criminal justice system. And even a short visit to the criminal justice system can be a really negative thing. I used to talk a lot with young people that were deeply at risk of developing problems with the juvenile justice system. And we'd have this conversation where I'd ask young people, like, what do you think the worst thing is that can happen to you when you go to jail? And most young people will answer that they're afraid that they will get like emotionally or physically hurt in jail. And I say, yeah, those things can happen, but the worst thing that happens to you when you go to jail is that you learn how to live in jail. And learning how to live in the criminal justice system is a very specific set of skills that doesn't really translate very well to other places. And so while your friends are learning how to like balance a checkbook or go to college or write a thesis, you're learning how to like, smuggle contraband into your cell so that you can learn how to play poker and gamble your way through the criminal justice system. And the time that you spend learning one thing, you never catch that up. So if you do leave jail, you're constantly in this process of trying to figure out like what are the rules for somebody my age and what am I supposed to do next. So the criminal justice system, I do not think is an artful way to deal with all issues related to alcohol or other drug misuse. There are certainly people out there who have substance use problems who are criminals. There are certainly people out there who are involved in the criminal justice system because they did not have the appropriate medical response to their substance misuse issues. So to me, looking at us as a society and the way that we respond to or contribute to the shaming of addiction or the way that we respond to or contribute to the criminalization of the condition is a problem. And we need to think about that and think carefully about what we're going to do moving forward. You know, people ask me all the time, like, what happens to a person when they misuse alcohol or other drugs? You know, like, what's the worst consequence that can happen to somebody when they misuse alcohol or other drugs? And I guess what I try to say to people is that the worst consequence is that people become absolutely isolated. Now, you will see people who are engaged in alcohol or other drug misuse that withdraw. They start to become dishonest, they become unreliable, they build a cocoon of silence around themselves, they separate from themselves and from other people. And what's hard about that, especially for those of us who have friends or family members who suffer from this, is you're looking at somebody who looks like the person you know, they sound like the person you know, they can tell you stories that are the same stories that the person that you know, but that person just isn't there anymore. And this is terrifying for parents. It's terrifying for siblings. It's terrifying for family members. Because the more a person gets isolated, the more withdrawn they become from society, from family, from friendship, the less able we are to kind of reach out and find them in that space, in a place where they can find change. Well, we contribute to that sense of isolation when we perpetuate stereotypes and discriminatory behavior against people with alcohol or the drug issues. Because if we're saying to somebody, you know, we believe there's something wrong with you, or you're a bad person, or whatever, because you do this, then that contributes to that person withdrawing from society. And I just say that one of the reasons I give this conversation is that the kind of discrimination that people experience, the kind of stereotyping that people experience, they know what's happening before you know that you're doing it to them. I can tell you this, and I say this knowing that the chief of police is like less than 20 feet from me right now. I was the bad kid from the bad family in the bad part of town. Girls dated me in high school to make their parents angry. Like, I was not anybody you wanted to spend time with. I was not a good person in my adolescent era. Like, I just was not. And I can tell you this, that one of the things that, one of my defense mechanisms was if you could see from the outside how I felt on the inside, whatever it was that bothered me about you, my defense mechanism is if you called me out for being verbally abusive, I got more verbally abusive. If you called me out for not paying attention, I would like go to sleep. If you called me out for being irresponsible, I would get more irresponsible. Whatever it is that, whatever way it was that you looked down on me, I like dug into that farther. I pulled farther away from it. Because I felt like if you didn't like me for the person I was, I could turn into somebody worse. I'm not saying every person with addiction has that experience, but I've seen people confronted about addiction and addictive behaviors pull into a wild kind of defense. That you can't touch me, you can't talk to me, you can't change me, you're not in charge of me, you can't hurt me, watch me hurt me. I will take whatever threat you give me and I'll take it to the next level. And so the reason I bring this up is that I think that when we're watching somebody who we care about and it feels like they're fading away from us, some of us get really desperate about that. You know, we think that if the person's pulling away, we will dive in harder. And sometimes when we're doing that, what the person is really hearing from us is that we really do think that there's something wrong, not with their behavior, but with who they are. And I can say this to you because I think I'm a reasonably good guy today. You know, I'm married, I have 2 kids that I put through college, I own a home, I pay taxes, I vote. I advise at the executive level on alcohol and drug policy as an openly recovering person and a social worker, and I'm one of the only people in the country who does that. Like, I've got a pretty good resume. You'd be lucky if you lived next door to me. Right? But I can tell you that there's a lot of people who've accomplished what I have and more, who carry this thing with them, and they think that what you see when you talk to them is a bad person. They think that the only part of them that they can show you is the part that you want to see, and not the person who they really are. And this hurts you. This hurts you. And I'm going to tell you why here in a second. If you know anybody who's ever been hurt by alcohol or other drugs, just raise your hand. A little higher. If you've ever known anybody, keep your hands up just for a second. If you've ever known anybody who's been hurt by alcohol or drugs and you tried to help them and the help didn't work, leave your hand in the air. Think about that for a second. Because while you're trying to help people, there's a whole community of people like me out there who know how to help people. And not just because I'm a counselor. Not just because I've worked in treatment. I, like some of my friends, I bought my house doing treatment. I sent my kids to school doing treatment. I got a great job in an awesome office with a building with a gold dome on it because I know about treatment. But there's a lot of people in our community who have survived addiction, who are an invaluable resource to all of us, but we don't know who they are because they're anonymous. We don't know who they are because they're afraid to say out loud what they've done. We don't know who they are. Not because they're afraid to say what they've done while they were using, but they're afraid to be 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, 50 years sober and say, you know what? While y'all are trying to figure out what to do in Bedford, I've been sober in this town for 30 years. I know where the landmines are. I know what we need to do as a town to make this town a safer place. That voice is taken from the dialogue, in part, I believe, because of stigma. And I'm going to tell you something, we're everywhere. People in recovery are everywhere. And I wish that during this epidemic that we had taken time to find those voices, to unearth them, to bring them into the public discourse. Because I think that, I guess what I can say, and this is going to get a little sophisticated, so I don't know that the at-home audience is going to follow this, so this is just for you. But recovery is indigenous. And what I mean by that is this, is that I got sober in New Jersey in 1987. I don't know what it means to be fresh in recovery in Manchester in 2017. I have a recovery network that's based in Exeter and Hampton. I don't know, if I moved to Bedford, I'd have to develop another recovery network here. Recovery doesn't work exactly the same way for exactly everybody everywhere. And so in order to ensure that our community is safe, we need to know what the natural resources for recovery are in our very own neighborhood. And to build that resource by just using clinicians, by just using what the government can do, we're outgunned. I don't know, but I know a lot of clinicians that have huge waiting lists for people coming through the door. Can't get people in fast enough, right? But there are people out there that can help more quickly, and I think some of those people are people who live in this community, who've discovered recovery, and might be able to talk to us a little bit more artfully and in a little bit more nuanced way about what it means to get sober in Bedford, New Hampshire in 2017. You know, when we look at addiction, and we look at what it costs people to be impacted by addiction, the one thing I want to say is this, is that relationships, human relationships, are the ultimate casualty of addiction. Overdose deaths are tragic. Incarceration is horrendous. Loss of job, loss of family, loss of resources is terrible. But at the end of the day, what we all end up losing is we all end up losing the trust and love of people closest to us. And so we're not just working here to save $2.36 billion. We're working here, this conversation is about saving the relationships that people have with each other. And how important is that to us? Because I can tell you this, your family may not live next door to my family, but your family absolutely impacts my family. And so I just want to let you know that there are 23 million people in long-term recovery in the United States. There are 23 million people who found this way out. And basically that number is almost equal to the number of people that have a current problem. So just because the system isn't there to help everybody, that doesn't mean that people aren't out there trying to get help. You know, if right now you got up from your chair and you fell down and you broke your ankle, what would you do? You call 911, the ambulance will come, they take you to the emergency room, they fix you up, give you an x-ray, put on a cast, you go home, you get the physical therapy, it all whoop wop in. 6 months from now, you wouldn't even know you broke your ankle until you're about 55, and then you'd feel that, but that's a story for another day. But if you take the doctor or the x-ray technician or the person who puts the cast on out of that equation, if you take the hospital or the ambulance, right, if you take 911 out of the equation, all of a sudden your calculus for doing what everybody seems to know intuitively how to do changes drastically. Just because we don't have treatment for people doesn't mean that people aren't trying to find a way to healing on their own. And so what we need to be doing is thinking about what can we as society do to support better the people that will naturally and logically develop substance use disorder over time. I guess what I would say to you is that for me, you know, people ask me like, how'd you make it? What'd you do? What was this, that, and the other thing? I can tell you this. I think that a large part of me growing up the way I did and being the person I am today has mostly to do with blind, dumb luck. I've always been lucky. I don't know why. I've always been lucky. What I mean by that is I've been through circumstances that are horrific, but at the end of the day, I tend to find a way to like kind of make it through to the next level. And as a result of that, I'm interminably hopeful. Even though I recognize that we don't have enough resources to address the issue that we have in front of us, even though I recognize that many of us are crippled by stereotype and discrimination when it comes to this issue, even though this is like my 7th drug crisis, I've been doing this stuff for a long time, like drug crisis, drug crisis, drug crisis. I've seen a bunch of them. In spite of all that, I've had the profound honor of seeing people get well. And I think we're getting closer and closer to helping more and more people get well. And so my tiny contribution to this is that I'm not an alcoholic or a drug addict. I'm a person who lives in recovery. But before I'm a person who lives in recovery, I'm a person. And if we can remember whoever's walking through the door to look at us, to work with us, no matter how tiring the process, no matter how hopeless, no matter how out of control this whole thing, we remember that the person in front of us is a person, and we start by recognizing the humanity of every person we encounter, the outcomes are going to be a lot better. So I don't know if this is helpful. It's what a few years of study have done for me. And I guess I'll just ask people if you have any questions. Once, twice.
Well, I have a question for you, Marty.
Hit it.
All right. So the impact and the implication of stereotypes when dealing with a challenge such as the opioid crisis that we have here in New Hampshire is pretty large. Stereotypes, for example, most people think that cops just want to throw everybody who has a substance abuse problem in jail. Right. And that's not true. And here in Bedford, we have programs where we try to remove people from the criminal justice system and get them into treatment and recovery and to circumvent that cycle that really doesn't lead to any place good. But what's your advice in terms of keeping in line with your notion that with the dearth of treatment and recovery in New Hampshire, relying on everyone in this room to go out and try through BeBOLD and other organizations or themselves to improve people that are suffering and families suffering with addiction or substance abuse. What's your best advice in terms of dealing with the stigma, in terms of getting other people engaged in the discussion in the problem? What do you see as being things that we can do that are most effective?
The first thing I would say is, while it's absolutely true that at least one person in 10 has some kind of chronic or acute substance use disorder, it's also true that 1 person in 6 is directly impacted. Some people say 1 person in 4. And so what I would do is I would try to keep that piece in mind. Because what happens is we forget that we're not alone. Like if you're impacted by this, if you have a friend or neighbor or you yourself are impacted, it impacts you, your employer, it impacts every part of your life. So I would just encourage you to consider the huge number of people that are hurt by this and to find a voice to advocate for more ways, more support, a better understanding, improved research, better treatment. Like we can turn the tide on this if we keep present in our minds that when this crisis is past, there will be another crisis. The chronicity of substance misuse is a constant. Since we started collecting data on it, it is a constant. And it's not going to go away. So either we can deal with it as it is, or we can pretend that it's something it's not. And it's not a temporary problem. It is a chronic part of the human condition.
So it's acceptance of the fact that it's been with us. I like to say to folks that since the first Inca Indian chewed on a coca leaf, we've had substance abuse problems.
Yes.
It's not going to go away.
No.
It's never going to go away.
Right.
You have to accept that. Forget about the notion that there's a war on drugs because that's a misnomer.
Yeah.
So by accepting it and by talking about it, bringing more awareness, it's not true that we can engage folks in better ways of dealing with the development of pathways to be more effective at dealing with substance abuse. Is that not true?
We need to realize that we're involved in what they like to call in grad school an iterative process. We're learning more and we're testing more and we're learning more and we're testing more, and we got to stop thinking that we're going to find a magic bullet. We just have to get used to the fact that we have a lot to do. We have a lot to learn. There's a lot that we can move forward. And I think one of the reasons why considering stereotype and discrimination and stigma as a part of that is that one of the things that we know is that cancer research grew enormously after we started to move away from the discrimination and stereotype associated with cancer. Services for people, we have parades for people who are survivors now. That didn't happen when I was a child. When I was a small little Marty, like people didn't talk about, I was little ones, people didn't talk about having cancer. Nobody talked about it. I'm saying now that we're talking about it, let's not just talk about the disease, let's also talk about the recovery. Because the recovery is real and we can bring better, more accurate, and more helpful information moving forward.
One more question. Any questions from the audience?
I have one.
Great.
So my question is, you talk about the stigma, you talk about this, what is the state doing to help employers have a better way to communicate with their employees? What are you doing within the hospitals to communicate better? Like, how are you getting that out? Because I mean, look at the turnout here. Obviously, you probably advertise this, like, this is how many people care right now. Nobody cares. So how are we going to make people understand how to get it into the workplace, how to do those things?
So I'm gonna offer an alternative perspective to nobody cares.
Well, I'm just saying, like, in general, like, I don't mean that way. I'm just saying, like, people care, but people, like, nobody, again, kind of what you were saying, nobody's going to talk about it around the Thanksgiving table.
Right. So what I'd say is two things. One is, I think part of what we're starting to see right now in the state is something called issue fatigue. Like, people have been talking about this for a while, and we haven't really moved the needle. And I think that this happens with a lot of issues, but I can tell you this, like, I was working in this field before people thought about an opioid crisis, right? The publicity of this and waxes and wanes, like, that's just a part of the way that we as humans process information. With that said, I want to talk about something really exciting that I think the governor's doing that I think actually could move the needle. The governor in the next few weeks is going to announce something called the recovery-friendly workplace. And essentially, this is an idea of working with employers to do a few different things. But one is to acknowledge that addiction is real, and there are more artful ways of dealing with it than firing people or drug testing people with the result of that being fired. There are things that are evidence-based, there's science out there that indicates that if we employ certain practices in workplaces, we can actually increase worker productivity, increase the number of people that stay in their jobs, decrease absenteeism. And there's another really amazing thing about the recovery-friendly workplace. As a guy who spent a lot of his life in gymnasiums at like 9 o'clock at night with 7 people, one of the questions we always ask is like, why can't we get the parents to come? Well, the recovery-friendly workplace has a different answer. a different answer as long as we go to where the parents are. Because a lot of people are working. And so if we get employers to allow us to use, brown bag lunches or an hour every 6 months to sit down and talk, we will be able to distribute more information accurately without passion or prejudice in a scientific way to more parents than we've ever been able to touch in a very long period of time. And so that's the governor's initiative. It's his idea. It's actually, I think it's a very brilliant idea. I'm glad to be a part of this thinking about it. And I think it's one of the things that he's going to do that will be able to move the needle.
Great question. Marty Boldin, Governor's Policy Advisor on Substance Abuse, Addiction, and Recovery. This is a marathon, not a sprint, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Chief.
Again, folks, this is BeBOLD Speaker Series presentation. Join us again the fourth Monday every month at 7 p.m. here in the Bedford Library for our next Speaker Series event. Thanks so much. Thank you all.